Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am, as always, happy to be back with you. I have another author to bring to you today, and I hope you're having a good Tuesday. It was actually, I want to say cold. It wasn't cold here. It's very damp here, and considering that the temperature was probably warmer than 90% of the U.S., I cannot complain. You know, it rained, we didn't have snow, but the humidity sometimes makes it feel much colder than it actually is, and today was one of those days. However, did this stop me from sitting outside with a friend for a tea date? It was late in the afternoon, so we didn't have coffee. We had lovely orange ginger tea, and we sat outside because she had her puppy with her. So did that stop me from sitting outside? No. Was I cold? A little bit, yeah, but I had long sleeves and a sweater, and really what is there to complain about? That was a random conversation about the weather, but also pointing out that I had a lovely tea date with a friend today, in addition to working and running errands and taking our dogs to the vet. My husband and I found a new vet, which is good, and both of our dogs are just feeling slightly under the weather, so we took them to the vet, had them seen. They're both doing fine, but they both got a prescription, and hopefully they'll start feeling better soon. Two completely different things, so they like to keep us on our toes. But yeah, a very productive day that ended with, like I said, a very lovely tea date with a new friend that I have met here since moving to Portugal. She and her husband moved here from South Africa about 2 months before my husband and I did. So they're just a little bit ahead of us. She's way ahead of me in the fact that her family is Portuguese, though, so she has spoken Portuguese her whole life. I do not speak Portuguese. I speak very bad Portuguese, but I keep trying. So that is enough. And I keep saying so. Need to stop using that as my filler word. Keep reminding myself of that. At any rate, I hope you're having a great Tuesday and you had a good weekend, whatever you may have done. Can't believe we're just trucking through January as fast as we are, but we are. So, see, there I did it again. Gonna work on that. Hold me accountable. Listen to me. Don't do it like sending me tallies of every time I say it, and don't make it a drinking game. Please, neither of those things, but you can hold me accountable. At any rate, author interview. I am speaking today with Scott Russell Sanders about his novel, or his it's a collection of short stories, but they're all connected, and they read more like a novel, but he wrote them as short stories. The book is called Small Marvels. In Limestone, Indiana, a city tucked away among forested hills, peculiar things often happen. Often in the vicinity of a jack-of-all-trades named Gordon Mills. Centaurs and nymphs shelter in a local cave, alligators lurk in the sewers, warm snow falls on the 4th of July, cornstalks rise higher than chimneys, and the northern lights shine down on the municipal dump. Gordon takes such events in stride and deals with them as part of his work on the city maintenance crew. He earns just enough to support a boisterous family, which includes his formidable wife, Mabel, their 4 children, Mabel's parents, and his widowed mother. 9 souls packed into an old house that falls apart as fast as Gordon can fix it. Part folktale, part comic romance, Small Marvels revels in the wonders of everyday life. So welcome to Limestone, Indiana. You won't find it on a map, but you may remember visiting the place in dreams, the rare blissful ones in which puzzles are solved, kids flourish, hard work pays off, and love endures. And again, the book is called Small Marvels. The author is Scott Russell Sanders. This book is so full of hope and joy. It is like a lovely shot of dopamine and serotonin all wrapped up. I laughed. I think the very first page, it made me laugh, but it also made me smile. You know, those just big smiles of, oh, that's just so nice. That is so lovely. The characters, I mentioned at one point in the interview, you might think that they're kind of simple at first, but they're not. They're so complex and multi-layered. But they're just this lovely family that has their problems, has their issues, but they're kind to one another. They love one another. They're kind to neighbors. And then you have this magical realism, the peculiar things that happen in Gordon's presence. And they don't even feel that strange. You're just like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course that would happen in this collection of short stories. Yeah, if you're looking for a pick-me-up, a feel-good book, then you should definitely check this one out. Let's go ahead and turn to the interview so that you can hear Scott's story behind writing these stories and just all of his thoughts in general on writing. Again, the book is called Small Marvels. The author is Scott Russell Sanders. Let's go to that interview. Hi, Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
I'm happy to have you here, and we're going to talk about your book, Small Marvels. But before we do that, if you would please take a few minutes and just share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
All right. My full name is Scott Russell Sanders. I live in Southern Indiana. I'm retired from teaching at Indiana University. And I'm a country boy, first generation college graduate from my family. I was born in the country outside of Memphis and grew up in the country in northeastern Ohio. And that actually is a factor in the background of Small Marvels. I could return to that. I was good at science and math, and that carried me from the back roads of Ohio on a full scholarship to Brown University, where I studied physics, math, and fell in love with English, which seduced me away from becoming a scientist. Got another scholarship, which took me to the University of Cambridge in England, where I earned my PhD. And by then I was married. I was married to my high school sweetheart. She didn't go to my high school. I met her at a science camp one summer during the summer between our junior and senior years. And we're still married. Her name is Ruth Ann McClure Sanders. And that's also relevant to Small Marvels. We've been married 54 years, and the book is in part about long marriage and that it's possible and some of the qualities that make it possible. So I taught at Indiana University for my entire career. I made some visiting lectures and talks and classes all over the country and across Europe. But this has been home base here in the hill country of southern Indiana since 1971. I've published 25 books for adults and 7 books, picture books, storybooks for children. And the mixture of books for adult readers include novels, collections of short stories, personal narrative, and books of essays. So I think that's probably enough for listeners to get some sense of my background and the path that I have followed.
Yeah, that's great. And I like that you've written novels and short stories and essays, because Small Marvels actually kind of reads a little bit like all of those. Can you give an overview of the book?
Well, because of that early interest in science, which persists today. I didn't become a scientist, but I still love and am fascinated by science. Three of my novels and one collection of short stories are science fiction. And they're not about aliens. They're not about robots. They're about aspects of the universe and aspects of our society that are deeply influenced by science and technology. So science fiction is one of my interests. I'm also interested in work, the kinds of work that people do, especially manual work. And again, that's part of the background for Small Marvels. I am passionately concerned about the environment, about racism, sexism, and various other forms of biases that humans suffer from. And much of my writing deals with environmental issues, conservation, peacemaking efforts, and the tragedy of war. And also, I write a lot about family and community, and that's true both in my fiction and in my nonfiction.
Did you have an initial inspiration for the story? You've mentioned a few things, but was there an initial jumping off for this book?
For Small Marvels? Yes. The books I've written, the books mainly of nonfiction, but a couple of novels over the last 20 years, have often dealt with very dark subjects. The extinction of species, global climate disruption, war, racial strife, political polarization, the things that all listeners recognize are afflicting our world. They show up in every day's headlines. And a fair amount of my writing over the past 20 years has been about those kinds of issues, and also issues of ill health within my own family. My wife has Parkinson's disease. Our son has stage 4 cancer. My sister has stage 4 cancer. And again, given the age of my wife and myself, many of our contemporaries are suffering various kinds of health issues. So I've written about that as well. In order to remind myself of the human capacity for kindness, for faithfulness, for honesty, for hard work, for various kinds of virtues, kindness, simple kindness, in order to remind myself of that in the midst of all of these troubles that are so familiar to all of us, I would periodically return to this family, the Mills family, Gordon and Mabel Mills and their 4 children and the 3 living grandparents. I would periodically return to them and write a story about them and living in this fictional town that I call Limestone, Indiana, in the hill country of southern Indiana, near where I live. I would return to them as a way of reminding myself of our capacity for loving one another, for doing good work, for being honest with one another, for caring for people who need to be cared for being neighborly. And then I would return, having written a story or two about the Mills family, I would return to these darker subjects that have filled my books of essays and a couple of my novels. So the inspiration, in a way, wasn't one moment. It was the need for the reminder of the human virtues. It sounds corny to speak about this because our popular culture, the news media, virtually all of the media, emphasize strife, conflict, violence, ridicule, because that's what attracts human attention. Anything that makes us afraid or makes us worried or makes us angry will grab our attention. There are good, simple evolutionary reasons for that. And for that reason, since the media are seeking our attention, that's what they have to sell to their sponsors, is our eyeballs and our ears. The media tend to focus on the most violent, the cruelest, the stupidest, the ugliest, the most destructive aspects of human character. Those are all real aspects. I don't deny them for a moment, and I do myself sometimes write about them. But it's so easy to forget as we immerse ourselves in the daily news that most humans, most of the time, are decent to one another. Most husbands are faithful to their wives and wives to their husbands. Most parents care for their children. Most children, when their parents grow old, do everything they can to ease the late years of their parents. But one can forget this about the human capacity for sharing, for caring, for loving. One can forget that in the face of the onslaught of news about human cruelty, disloyalty, dishonesty. And I wanted to write a book that enabled me to dwell on those qualities that I desire for myself, that I desire for the people who live around me. A little anecdote will illustrate this. I mentioned that I write children's books. Here in the local school district, I live in Monroe County, Indiana, and we have good schools here, dedicated teachers. Most parents are very supportive of studies. And I often go into the schools to read stories to children and to tell them about the importance of reading and writing and how I learned to read and write and why it matters to me. And as I walk down the hallways of these elementary and middle schools, I notice that there are frequently signs on the walls and posters on the walls with values expressed on them. They'll say hard work. They'll say honesty, always tell the truth. They'll say help other people. They'll say share things. These are all qualities we would love our children to have, or our grandchildren to have, and our neighbors to have. So I would read these signs, and then I would think about Congress, the White House, big business, big pharmaceutical companies, wars going on. All the qualities that we're urging our children to emulate are not demonstrated, or at least they're rarely demonstrated in the public media. So I wanted to write a book of linked stories. They all make a novel over the course of the 24 stories in Small Marvels. I wanted to write a book about ordinary people. It's a working class family living in a small town in what many people think of as flyover country, where nothing important happens. And I wanted to celebrate the simple virtues and the simple pleasures of this family and some of the adventures that they had in their town.
I'm going to jump in here. We're going to take our first break for this episode, but remember that word simple, because I'm going to bring it up again after the break, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Scott Russell Sanders about his book, Small Marvels. Before the break, he said he wanted to highlight the simple virtues of this family. I told you before the break to remember that word simple. It's going to lead you into my next question, so let's get back to the interview.
And you used the word simple, which was actually segues nicely into my next comment, because at first glance, when you start reading about this family, they can seem like they're maybe kind of simple. You know, they're working class. They have multiple generations living in one house. They're not wealthy. But when you really delve into it, they're very layered and complex. And the way they work together is just, well, it's beautiful, but they're not a simple family by any means, and even though it comes from a place of joy and hope, they do address some of those darker issues in the stories as you write them.
Well, I appreciate your observation, Sarah, because there's darkness in the background, as you're suggesting. Gordon Mills lost his father to an accident when Gordon was 18 years old, and dropped out of school because he became the sole source of income for his mother, and joined the Navy and was sent to the Middle East and worked as an engineer, really driving big machines for the Seabees in the Middle East during times of war. And he saw terrible things there, and those terrible things haunt him. And then the teenagers have teenage issues: loneliness, breakup, mild depression. The elders, the older generation, there's a case of dementia among one of the three living grandparents. So it's not as though everything is happy-go-lucky in this world, and you're very right to observe that. The family deals with these painful matters, and including losses in the past. They deal with them in a way that ordinary people do. You face it, you're honest about it, and you learn ways of coping. And you try never to pass on harm to others simply because you may have suffered a loss. One of my favorite examples of this is the youngest of the four children, as you will recall, is Danny. And he's 6 years old during the year that this book covers. He turns 7 over the course of that year. And Gordon, when he gets depressed, as he does sometimes, or blue, he wouldn't say depressed. When he gets blue, Danny's the only one who can cheer him up. And one of the ways he does it is to tell him knock-knock jokes. And that seems silly. And Gordon, when Danny starts telling him knock-knock jokes, Gordon, first of all, continues to be grumpy. But eventually he can't resist Danny's sheer love and joy in those little jokes. And finally, Gordon relaxes and gets over his dark mood. There's another quality to this book that I think you're alluding to, and I'll just highlight it. Strange things, peculiar things happen in this city. There's a fossil of a businessman is dug up on a project that Gordon's working on, and the archaeologists come and study the fossil businessman, who complete with a briefcase and wing-tipped shoes. There are mythological animals, centaurs and phoenixes and others, dragons, living in a cave on the edge of this county. And the city fathers and mothers and the city council want to use the mythological creatures as a destination for tourists to attract them to town. There are alligators in the sewer system, which Gordon is ordered to clean out. There's a snow on July 4th that's dry. It looks like snow, but it's simply dry. It's some white, fluffy stuff. And it snows several feet of that, and Gordon has to go out with the snowplow on the July 4th to clear the way for the parade that will follow him. So there are these, what the reader might think of as magical or fantastic things happen in this town, and especially whenever Gordon is around. But one of the qualities I love about Gordon is he never treats them as strange. He just takes it in stride and does what he needs to do to cope with whatever the situation is. So when he's ordered to get the alligators out of the sewer system, he doesn't say, how on earth could alligators get in the sewer system? He simply goes about engineering a machine that will terrify the alligators that promptly flee and follow the water courses from southern Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico. So there are strange things that happen, and a reader might think of them as colorful or odd or magical things. But to the people in the Mills family, they just take them in stride. The title alludes to that theme in the book, small marvels. I could have called it small wonders or small miracles. My point is not that it's a miracle or a marvel that centaurs are living in a local cave, or that alligators are living in the sewer system, or that the northern lights shine down on the town dump. Those aren't the marvels I'm referring to. The marvels I'm referring to are the simple everyday beauties that we encounter and that we're so accustomed to, we fail to see how miraculous they are. Anyone who's ever looked out the window and seen a hummingbird at a feeder, or a monarch butterfly on a flower, or a seedling coming up out of the soil is looking at a miracle, because it's familiar to us if we're lucky enough to have hummingbirds near us, or monarch butterflies, or to have a garden where some seedling can come up. We're so accustomed to this that we forget, or we lose a sense that all young children have, that the world is filled with astounding things. The very fact that you and I are breathing, that our hearts are beating, that trillions of processes are going on in the cells in your body and in the cells in my body and in the bodies of all the listeners. That is astounding. Our brains, with our billions of neurons, are processing sounds and sense impressions constantly. Our minds are filled with thoughts constantly. And all of these are amazing, miraculous realities in the midst of a universe which, so far as we so far have observed, has no other life. I suspect there is life out there, but we haven't received any definite evidence of it yet. But here we are on this planet where we can breathe the air, we can drink the water, the soil and human labor produces food that we can eat, and the seas produces food that we can eat. And I would love to have readers come away from reading my little book feeling and sensing a fresher awareness of the miracles around them.
So when you started writing the short stories, did you have that sense? Was it more of the sense of the everyday miracles, or did you think of it? Did you set out to write maybe some magical realism into the stories, or did it just sort of evolve naturally as you wrote the stories?
I think it did evolve naturally, which was also the case with the characters. I wrote, as I do usually typically when I write stories or write a novel, I will write sketches for the characters, a sense, how old are they? What are their interests? What hobbies do they have? What's important things should I know about their history? And many of those background pieces of information never make it onto the page, but it's important for me as a writer to have a fuller three-dimensional sense of the character. But characters evolve as I follow them through the course of the writing. So I learned a lot more about Gordon. I learned a lot more about his wife, Mabel, who's a very important figure in the book, and about the 4 children over the course of the writing. And that's, I think most writers of book-length fiction would tell you that the character that they imagined when they set out to write the book has changed, at least somewhat. Maybe in some cases changed considerably by the time the book is finished and turned over to the publisher. What appealed to me about Gordon was there from the beginning, and that is he's a man who is extremely capable in the use of tools. He can make anything, he can fix anything, he can drive anything, he can operate any kind of machine. And that was true of my father, who was definitely a major source of the inspiration for Gordon. Gordon isn't just a carbon copy of my father. He's borrowed traits from my father. Similarly, Mabel, Gordon's wife, has a lot of traits that come from my mother. She was a wonderfully competent person who could grow food, could grow flowers, could can and preserve food. She could make garments. She could repair garments. She could paint. She did oil painting and watercolors. She was highly artistic. She didn't relate well to numbers. She wasn't mathematically or scientifically inclined, but she had a wonderful artistic gift. And between the two of them, my father and mother, he had the paying job. She did the volunteer work. They were very typical of couples in their generation. My mother was head of the PTA. She was the head of the Girl Scouts. She was a Sunday school teacher at church. She was a volunteer for other things in the community. She didn't get paid for any of that, of course, but she was working constantly while she was raising 3 kids. And my father did manual work when I was a boy. He grew up on a farm in Mississippi, and then he made tires for Firestone and eventually became a production manager for a factory. And late in his working career, he had a white shirt on and sat behind a desk. But he was a working class man, and he had that quality of skill, physical skill. He could fix things, he could make things, he could build things, he could grow things. And I have maybe 50%, maybe not even that much, maybe 33 1/3% of the skills that my father possessed. And I'm very grateful for that. And some of my skills are ones that I learned from my mother as well. I know how to put a button on a shirt. I know how to iron a shirt. Now, they no longer need ironing, but when I was a teenager, I would iron my shirts to go to church. I can grow food. I can cook. I can bake bread. I learned all those things from my mother. So one of the things that the book is doing, and I discovered more and more of it as I worked my way through the book, is honoring qualities, skills, gifts that don't very often get honored in popular media. We don't read about working class people very often. We don't read about people whose gifts are more physical than intellectual. And we certainly don't read about families, 3 generations of families living under a single roof. Gordon and Mabel, the year that the book is set in, which is, I imagine, is roughly now, is the year when Gordon and Mabel have reached their 25th wedding anniversary. So they've been married a 1/4 century. They're carrying, his father died, as I mentioned, in an accident in the limestone quarry. But his mother lives with the family, and his wife's parents live with the family. So they're an in-between generation, Gordon and Mabel, who have their own children, 4 children, the youngest of whom is 6, the oldest of whom is 19, 2 daughters, 2 sons. They have their own children to care for and their parents to care for. So they're that sandwich generation. And there are millions of people in America like that. And you will look long and hard to find a novel that has such people in it. So part of what I was doing in this book, and I discovered much of it as I went along, was honoring qualities, human qualities, and also human family and marital arrangements that I wanted to honor.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, you did a wonderful job of answering a lot of my initial questions with you by answering one. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Time for our second break of the episode, but I really do enjoy when my guests just do my job for me and answer half the questions I already have. It's quite lovely. At any rate, we're going to take that break, and when we come back, Scott will be talking about what he is working on now. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Scott Russell Sanders.
Are you working on anything currently?
I am. I'm working on a book of nonfiction, which is about the idea of community. The thesis of the book is simple, and that is that we depend for our well-being far more on what we share than on what we own as individuals or as families. Our culture puts such an emphasis on private ownership, private wealth, personal property. Those are important things for sure, but we put such an emphasis on those individualistic or at most family scale values, forms of wealth, that we ignore the crucial importance of the wealth that we share. Simple examples. There was a opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago by a man who wrote to say we shouldn't have to pay taxes for public libraries because anybody can buy any book they want from Amazon. It's the sort of statement that somebody for whom money is no issue would make. But public libraries are part of what I think of and describe as the commonwealth, just like streets are, and schools are, and fire departments, and police departments, and courts, and parks, and the air, and the ocean, and running water. Those are all parts of the commonwealth, the shared wealth. And there are so many pressures in our culture to undermine, to sell off, to degrade the shared world in the interests of increasing the wealth of a relatively small fraction of our society. There's so many pressures to dismantle the commonwealth, to exploit the commonwealth, that I want to write a book that champions the commonwealth. So that's what I'm working on now.
Do you have a working title?
Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth, one word, and the subtitle would be Living in a Shared World.
So you have had a love of words for quite a long time. When did you decide to start writing in terms of writing for publication?
It was in my 20s. I had kept a journal, as many people do. I'd kept a journal in college and wrote hundreds of letters. I'll come back to that in a moment because it was a key to launching me into a writing life. It was in my 20s, and I started exclusively with short stories, and that was all I wrote for a long time. I mentioned letters, and I mentioned my long marriage to Ruth, my wife. We met during a summer science institute after our junior years in high school. She was coming from Indiana. I was coming from Ohio, and we met there. She was 15, I was 16. And we had the sort of puppy love that 15 and 16-year-olds have. And when I got back home, a couple of days after I got home, after this 8-week summer institute, there was a letter from Ruth. I had been sure that I would never see or hear from her again, but there was this really lively, interesting letter. It had a slight perfume on it, about which I teased her later. And I had, at that point in life, because I was such a science kid, I had never written a letter, a substantial letter, except maybe to thank my grandparents for a Christmas gift. So here was this lively, lovely letter from this girl I had just spent 8 weeks mooning over, and I needed to answer it. And I was so intimidated. I just did not know how to write a letter as lively and engaging to her as she had written to me. So I put it off for a few days while I was working in a factory. And lo and behold, another letter from Ruth arrived. And then I thought, oh, I am getting in deep trouble. I had better answer. So I wrote a letter as well as I could, tried to sound interesting and romantic and all those things that a 16-year-old boy might imagine. And then she wrote me back, and I wrote her back, and she wrote me back. Well, a year later, we had written dozens and dozens of letters back and forth. She was telling me what she was doing in her senior year in high school. I was telling her what I was doing in my senior year in high school. We arranged to meet at her home before I went off to college. She went to Indiana University, and I went to Brown University. And we saw one another for a weekend at her parents' home, and then we wrote letters. To jump ahead, by the time we had graduated from college, we had been writing letters to one another for 5 years. And during those 5 years, we had been actually physically together for the 8 weeks of the summer camp, and then maybe a total of 2 weeks total on times when I would stop and stay at her house. And on the strength of those 8 weeks plus 2 weeks, let's say 10 weeks of physical presence to one another, and hundreds of letters, we got married. She was 20, I was 21. It did not occur to us that we didn't know one another well enough to get married. And the reason we knew one another well was because we had written all those letters. And what it taught me was the power of writing to convey things that matter to us, to describe experiences that are powerful and leave a deep impression on us, to evoke one life that you share with the person reading it. Ruth's letters did that for me about her life, and I did everything I could to make my letters as evocative as hers. And right now, in the floor directly above where I'm sitting, Ruth is working on a quilt, and on her quilting table is a large box. It's about the size of a double sink, about that dimension. And it's completely filled with the letters that we wrote to one another, because she saved all of my letters to her, and I saved all her letters to me. And frankly, I can't bear to read them because I know I will sound so naive, because I was naive and hopelessly, helplessly romantic. But Ruth won't let me throw them out because they mean a great deal to her. Anyway, I didn't ever...
Let me just jump in and say I'm very good for Ruth, because I was just going to ask if you still had the letters. So I'm on Team Ruth here.
Thank you. I'll convey your support.
Thanks.
But so now, today, of course, I've been teaching for over 40 years now. And when I teach classes in the personal essay, I tell my students, and they range from undergraduates right up through graduate school, I tell them one way to think of the personal essay, it's only one way, is to think of it as a letter to strangers. As a letter, in that you're telling a reader something that has happened to you, something you've thought about, something you've learned from other people, and trying to do it in a vivid, evocative way. But you're telling it to strangers, meaning they don't know anything about you or your world or the world you're telling them about except what you tell them. So the letter and all that letter writing had for me become a training in narrative, creating scenes, summaries, reflections, memories. And by the time I had finished writing my hundreds and hundreds of letters, and I'm not exaggerating the number, in the last couple of years, our junior and senior years in college, we were writing a couple letters a week. That's over 100 letters each way a year. By the time I had done that 5 years of letter writing, I had come to realize the potential power of writing in a way that had never occurred to me as a reader. One of the things that most readers do when they open a book is they assume that the words on the page are the only way those words could have been arranged. They don't think, oh, well, the author could have done this or that, or written differently, or had the scene go in a different direction. They simply take what's on the page for the way it had to be. But of course, anyone who's done any sustained writing realizes that writer makes thousands, tens of thousands in the course of a book, decisions about word choice, sentence structure, theme, what a character says or doesn't say, what you notice about the background or the setting and what you don't notice. So a book that actually is printed and you're holding in your hands is the result of countless choices that a writer has made. Well, if a person thinks about even writing something as simple as a greeting card to a friend, if it's a genuine effort to convey something to that friend about how you care for them, or you wonder about them, or you think about them, you realize that you ponder what to say. You don't just slap down any old thing. And that's what happens when you're writing a letter to somebody who matters to you. And Ruth mattered and continues to matter enormously to me. And in many ways, she taught me to be a writer.
I love that. That is wonderful. Out of your own experience, then, do you have, and you've said some of this, I think, but do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Well, most of the advice, I'm sure, Sarah, is going to be familiar to them, but it's familiar because it's good advice, not because it comes from me, but because it comes from most experienced writers. First is we learn to write primarily by reading. Any writer will tell you that your lifetime of reading is this trove of shapes and sounds and patterns that you've taken in, for the most part, unconsciously while you're reading books. You learn how scenes are created. You learn how dialogue is depicted. You learn how a plot is structured, if we're talking about fiction, or how an argument is made, or how a scene is established in nonfiction. So reading good quality work is the single most important thing. And then, of course, practicing writing. I think letter writing, journal writing is a way, it's like practicing a musical instrument or practicing shooting foul shots in basketball. All writers have done a lot of practicing in their lives, and the practicing may have taken place in a journal that they never show to anybody else. I've kept a journal off and on pretty consistently since I started college, and that was a long time ago. And some of it was just to record experiences or to put down thoughts, but I also was, after a certain point, realized that it was a practice arena. The journal is a practice arena. It's a place where you can try out making a sentence, making a paragraph, working through an idea, perhaps jotting down a scene. So keeping a journal. For one thing, you don't have to show your journal to anybody. You don't have to try to persuade somebody to publish it. And then once you do start writing work that you think you hope is worthy of being published and read by other people, then there are just almost an infinite number of pathways you can take. With the advent of the internet, there are so many platforms where people can and do publish their work, whether it's poetry or song lyrics or short stories or essays. There's still, of course, many, many wonderful magazines, but magazines have editors who say yes and no to your work, and the odds, depending on how celebrated the magazine is, it may take only a very tiny percentage of the work that's actually submitted for publication. That's why online publication is often an easier place to start for an aspiring writer. But eventually, most writers would like to be able to publish books. The books might be electronic. Again, the technology has made that possible. People can self-publish books. But there are also many wonderful independent publishers all across the United States who publish books of poetry, books of stories, novels, and books of essays and personal nonfiction. I think that writers should give themselves some years, not months, but years of practice before they risk sending their stuff to places, sending their manuscripts to magazines. The reason is that if your work is still green, if it really hasn't matured, you're likely to have your work turned down. And that can be discouraging and make you stop writing. If you're more patient, if you say, look, I'm still learning, I have a lot to learn, I find a circle of friends who are also writing, and I'll share my work with them, and I'll read their work and learn from their work. Maybe I'll take a writing workshop, a summer writing workshop. I think if you're patient and not over eager to get your work published, you're likelier to keep at the work because you can see the improvement in your own work.
And time for the final break of the episode. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Scott Russell Sanders.
In terms of reading, when you take the time to read for yourself, who are your go-to authors and genres?
Genres. I read a lot of nature writing, the celebration of Earth and its creatures. So among my favorites there are famous people like Thoreau, whose work I love, and John Muir. But among our contemporaries, Wendell Berry, who writes poetry, fiction, and essays, lives in Kentucky. Annie Dillard, many wonderful books, best known for Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Terry Tempest Williams, another wonderful writer of prose and about the earth and our place on the earth. And another favorite writer who was a contemporary of mine, but alas died 2 years ago, Barry Lopez, a superb writer and a significant thinker. I'm also interested in philosophy and cosmology. That sounds like a big fancy deal, but cosmology, by cosmology, I mean people who think about our place in the universe. One of them is another Barry, a man named Thomas Berry, Ralph Waldo Emerson, contemporary roughly of Thoreau. His philosophy interests me a great deal. I'm interested in Buddhist writers like Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese teacher and Buddhist. Among novels, I'm a great admirer of Wallace Stegner. Again, some of the fiction of Barry Lopez and of Wendell Berry, Toni Morrison's fiction. In poetry, I love the work of Mary Oliver. In a traditional way, I love the work of Robert Frost. I read poetry by William Blake, the mystic, early 19th century mystic in England. I don't read a lot of contemporary poetry, and I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. That is our own present day fiction. I find too much of it is too narrowly human. That is, it focuses on stories about people that seem to take place entirely inside of human structures. People sitting in a coffee shop talking about why their marriage is falling apart, while there's this whole earth and this whole universe out there that never gets mentioned. I love writing which acknowledges that we're creatures living on this amazing, gorgeous, abundant planet, and that our planet is this dust mote in this astounding universe. I love writing that is aware of these larger contexts of human existence.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In terms of internet presence, if you have a website, if you can share that, as well as any social media that you are active on.
I'm not active on social media, and that's not a judgment about social media. It's a judgment about how I want to spend my time. So I don't follow social media, and I don't post on social media. I do have an internet. I do have a website, scottrussellsanders.com. Scott Russell Sanders is all one word, .com. And I post periodically there, what I call a journal. I post periodically on Goodreads, which is an Amazon subsidiary. But mainly I focus the writing that I do on work for publication, either in magazines or in books. I follow the news. I feel quite fortunate that I can sit here in my home and I can look at news feeds from many of the best publications on earth, both news media, science media, astronomy, cosmology, psychology, philosophy, as well as the daily news. And so I do a lot of reading, but I don't read social media. And I said at the outset of this that I'm not making a judgment about social media, but I think actually I am. Life is finite. And especially now at age 77, I'm very aware how finite it is. And I like to devote my attention to work that has been considered and matured and skillfully made. I don't like gossip. It's a waste of my time and my attention and my energy. And alas, too much of what passes for social media is quickly and crudely written. It's shallowly thought through, and it's ephemeral. Ezra Pound, who was problematic politically, but was an interesting poet, said once about poetry. He said, poetry is news that stays news, meaning you can read a good old poem and it'll still move you. And I would more generally say that the art that interests me, painting, music, fiction, poetry, the art that interests me is art that's durable. That's not just about what's cool at the moment, what's current at the moment, or what drifted across a poet's or a writer's mind that morning. I want art. I want to spend my time trying to make art that will hold up, that can be read 10 years from now, or even conceivably 100 years from now, and still have something to say. And I also like to devote my reading time, my attention, to work that seems to me deeply thought, beautifully crafted, and durable.
All right. Well, I appreciate your honesty. Thank you. Scott, we've covered a variety of different topics today, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to highlight at this point?
I believe in books. That is something that's 200 or 300 or 400 pages long, with poetry 60 or 100 pages long. I believe in books as among the richest inventions that humans have come up with. And I say books as opposed to the scraps and bits and pieces. Again, this is connected to the impact of social media, that our attention, our thoughts, our stories have become tiny fragments. And books give the reader space and the writer space to say something complex and rich. And so I believe in books. I don't think books are ever going to disappear. They certainly are not the dominant social medium, a cultural medium that they were, say, 50 or more years ago. I'm not deluded about the role that they play in contemporary America. But I continue to feel that they are among the richest resources we have, both for the making of meaning, for writers to be making meaning, and for readers to seek meaning and understanding. So I'm a great advocate of books. That's why I'm a great advocate of literacy and of libraries.
Agreed. And thank you so much for your time, not only talking to me about Small Marvels, but about writing in general. I really appreciate it.
And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Sarah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Scott for joining me to talk about Small Marvels. As I said at the beginning, if you are looking for something that will make you laugh, that has elements of magical realism, that has wonderful relationships amongst family members, but will also just put a genuine smile on your face, then I definitely think you should check out Small Marvels, because it's mid-January and you might be living somewhere that you are already tired of winter, and you might need something that will put a genuine smile on your face. Check out Small Marvels. It might just do that for you. Thank you, as always, for joining me for this episode of the GSMC Book Review Podcast. You know what's coming next. If you have not done so already, there's a few things you can do to help out and get this podcast out to more people like yourselves. First thing is you can follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. As I said, as I said at the beginning, hold me accountable for all my filler words, but in a constructive criticism kind of nice way. No need to be mean. You're never mean. You are all the best. But anyway, you can interact with me on social media. You can also subscribe, follow this podcast on whatever podcast platform you listen to it on. That way you will always know when new episodes come out. And finally, you can leave a review. That review can be written or starred. Either way helps, again, to get this podcast out to more listeners. And I would be greatly appreciative if you were to do one or all of those things if you, as I said, have not done those already. And thank you in advance, and thank you in real time for being the wonderful listeners that you are, and for sticking with me on this podcast journey, and just sharing your lives with me as we go through and meet new authors together. I hope you will join me next time when I will be speaking with author Mark Chestnut about his book, Prepare for Departure. It is a memoir, and he will be stopping by to speak with me about that. So join me for the next episode. In the meantime, hope you're having a great start to your week. I hope it's not really, really crazy cold where you are, but if it is, I hope that you have plenty of time to stay inside, light a fire or turn up your heat, make a cup of something warm and comforting, and just get yourself lost in a great book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.